everybody, I'm the Artful Spuddler, and this is the very first video I'm going to show you and try and explain the process of batik to you. So I'm going to show you a project that I'm going to work on, and as I work through it, hopefully I'll be able to explain the process and it'll make it more clear to anybody out there that wants to try this. And I came across this picture which I thought would be perfect to show you as an example of how you build up the colours. So what I've done is I've drawn up a quick sketch. This has got probably way too much detail in it for what I need to be able to begin. So I'm going to transfer this in a much more limited form onto a new piece of paper. And the easiest way to do that is with a light box. So if I turn my light box on, move it over, and literally you just put another piece of paper over the top, and now I can just take off the basic levels from this rather than rub out what's there. That's still a really good reference drawing to have. So I'm going to draw this up and then I'll come back to you and show you what we do next. Well, the first thing I want to do is introduce you to the tools of my trade. Now traditionally, batik is usually done with a janting or canting. I tend to use this, but only when I'm doing very big pieces, because you can't get the fineness of the tips that I need. And I found an alternative so that you can work smaller. And that is this. Excuse the burning at the bottom. As you can see, these are very old. And the burning is from the heat of the wax over time of the plastic. But this does the same job, but it comes in much finer points. There are various types you can have. These ones with wooden handles I actually prefer because the wood doesn't hold the heat. Eventually those start to get quite hot. And they come in lots and lots of different fine nibs. So that gets popped into hot wax. With the trough above it, you scoop up the wax. You've got a little nib at the bottom, which this one is covered in wax at the moment. A little nib at the bottom, and that is how the wax comes out, and that's what you draw with. But I'm using for this paraffin wax, just pure paraffin wax. It's the cheapest option. But one big thing you need to do if you're using paraffin wax is open a window and make sure you have plenty of ventilation. So the first stage of batik is to put down the wax onto your raw paper, and this will create your whites, but in this case it's slightly off-white piece of paper. It's a 300 GSM craft paper, not watercolour paper, and I'm using that for a reason which you'll find out about later. So the very first thing I want to do is just see where on my image or my photograph there is the white, and then refer to the sketch, the very light sketch I've put on my paper, identify it on the paper, and then I can get cracking putting the wax in. When I'm ready to start my batik, I heat up my wax, and then once the beads of wax have melted fully, I put my kiska and my janting in those, let them heat up for a little while. Once they're heated, I then remove them from the wax pot, wipe them off so there's no drips that could contaminate or spoil my batik, make sure that all of the wax that's on the outside has been removed, and when I'm ready, I can start to batik. So I know where I'm going to put my kiska down for the first time, and because this is water, I'm going to start by putting lots of dots on my paper, because that replicates the spray and replicates water generally. But really all I'm doing right now is drawing on my paper with wax, with dots. I'm looking for all the white in my source image and I'm trying to replicate that on my paper. So I took my time doing my first wax, but when I was ready it was time to pick up my watercolours and mix up my first colour. As we're going from light to dark, I don't want to make this particular colour too bright or too dark or too intense. So I've chosen a Prussian blue, which is going to be the focal colour for this particular painting. And I've created myself a very, very pale wash, which I'm now going to put down in the areas that have got a lot of the white on. And this will just help to define the whites that are there already, help me see my way forward. And I'll be capturing some of that as well, because it's all relevant to the build-up of this batik into what I hope is going to be a beautiful painting. At this stage I want quite a bit of control, so I'm putting my paint down onto a dry paper at the moment, but I will be adding water later to add blends and just make variations of the tone of what I'm putting down to add some more interest. I'm focusing on the focal point of my painting, which is the curve of the wave at the moment. I'm leaving the foreground empty because there's a technical issue there with the oranges, and I'll come to that in a minute. So really all I'm doing is going methodically round the image. I'm referring to my source photo and really just looking to see where I can put some definition in. I'm painting on this colour around where I've put my wax dots already, because that will help me see where they are, but also it'll help give some subtle definition to the spray, because I'll be putting this colour under wax shortly. And the last thing I'm going to do is dry off my brush, make sure it's lovely and clean, and just pull off some of the liquid that I have on my paper. This will help with the blends, but it'll also help with the drying time. The paint is now dry. It's gone a little lighter, and these are quite cheap watercolour paints. I don't really mind that they go lighter because I'm used to that with my dyes, but you will need to compensate for that if you're going to try something like this at home. And now all I'm really doing is just going to go around, observe where I've got this light blue and wax it in. I'm going to pay special attention to where my spray is because that is very light and it's quite challenging to do, and I want to make sure I get that right. And then I'm going to go around, and again, I'm using dots at the moment because really I'm just putting a suggestion of the structure, a suggestion of the colours in. And once we get to the darker colours, I'll start to join up all these wax dots and they'll start to make sense. I'm also spending quite a lot of time on the body of water that's behind our wave because that is quite light, and so I can start putting an awful lot of that now in and make that a little bit more solid because that is probably the whitest area of this particular picture. So once I've finished my waxing in, it's time to turn to those oranges. And so what I've decided to do is to pop my original sketch on the light box behind my painting. So I've got a very good, accurate record in front of me of where I need to put my oranges. I've mixed myself up a reasonably strong sort of peachy orangey colour, and I'm now going to put that down on my paper. Really, all I'm doing with a nice fine brush on dry paper is transferring the shape that I've got on my sketch and just transferring that onto my paper with the paint and filling in the shape. I'm also going to add some other colours to it just to give it a little bit more interest, and I'll be naturally using wet paper in some places just to blend the colours in. This video I'm running through everything quite quickly, but don't worry, I'm going to do a project next which you could all try at home, and I'll be going into far more detail about the techniques that I'm using. Really at this stage though, all I'm doing is making sure that I put down my orange paint very accurately. I'm using the sketch behind to give me the reference because it's important I get these very, very tight and very accurate. And when I do the waxing in the next stage, I will also need to make sure that I'm very accurate with my waxing, because if I go outside where I've got my orange, I will cover up some of the white paper, and that will give me a halo effect at the end of the project, which I don't want. So this stage, all I'm really concentrating on is accuracy, but I'm also adding a little bit of extra colour. This one's slightly more yellow because I want to put a variation in the colour that's down there, because at the end of the day, colour is king. Now, before I finish this painting session, I also want to put in a little bit of lavender. If you have a look at the picture, you can see that actually where the orange is, there's a reasonable amount of lavender around it. And so I thought I'd put that in. And as long as I'm careful and I don't make this lavender colour too strong, I should be able to make some reasonable colours. And again, it'll add extra colour and interest to my final piece. I've taken a very fine brush and I'm just literally outlining around the outside of where my oranges are. But I'll also be adding a little bit more of this lavender elsewhere, whatever I see in my picture, to be honest. I want to try and prevent the orange and the lavender from mixing, so I'm being very careful, and I've made sure that my orange has dried fully before I tried to do this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time putting this in high accuracy again and onto dry paper, ideally, so that there's not any blends going on. And I need to make sure that I don't put down any of this lavender colour over my orange. So I'm using my finest brush. I've put some relaxing music on in the background, and I'm going to spend my time and enjoy what I'm doing. When I was happy that I hadn't missed anywhere and I made sure that my paint was absolutely dry, I was ready to wax in what I'd done, and really at this stage all I'm doing is tracing over the paint that I've put down. I did all the work in the painting stage here, and I need to focus now on accuracy. But if I accidentally wax further out than where the oranges are, I've got that lavender surrounding them, so everything should be fine. And I'm also going to catch some of that lavender in its own right, because it's also going to add a lot of interest to my final piece. Therefore, while I'm putting down the wax, I'm also observing my original photograph quite intensely and making sure that if I can see any orange or any lavender, Then I put some wax over the top and make sure that it stays on my paper and doesn't go a horrible colour when I start painting again. Any lavender that I don't cover with my wax will disappear because it's quite a light colour, and when we put the blue on it'll be overwhelmed and therefore you won't see it. So I went back to my relaxing music and took my time putting this wax in, and when I was finished it was time to pick up my paints again. Now that I've put that complementary colour in and I've got it nicely safe under wax, it's time to return to the Prussian blue. But I'm also going to introduce another colour to this because it's time to put some colour into my piece, and I've mixed up a medium strong Prussian blue, but I've also mixed up some turquoise. So first off, I'm going to lay down some of my Prussian blue as a very light wash, just focusing on where it needs to go, and in the foreground I'm making it a little lighter. I'm going to put the turquoise mainly in the curve, which is the focal point of the wave and of my painting, but I'll put a little bit elsewhere just to add a little bit more interest. Then I'll pick up my Prussian blue and add that as well. I'll get some blends going on and I'll just try and make it interesting and colourful. And when it comes to the foreground, I'm just going to keep that nice and light for the moment. And then as one final touch, I'm just going to put a little bit of this paint in the spray, just add a little bit more definition, although I do want it to be very subtle. I think it needs just a little extra. Now that I've put that quite light colour down, I'm going to go back and add some punch with some extra turquoise because I want to make the focal point of this painting the centre where the curve of the wave is. So by adding extra turquoise here and making it punchy, I'm going to attract the eye. So I'm going to dab on some quite strong turquoise and then I'll blend it in with the paints that are already there, making it a beautiful blend of colours and hopefully bring some real interest to the focal point of my painting. Then once I've finished adding my turquoise, I'm just going to go back with a bit of paper towel and take off some of the paint and the water that's on my paper, just to add a little bit more interest, help with the blends and help with the drying time. Okay, so I'm happy with that and it's time to leave that to dry and then I'll start waxing in again. So I put my wax back on, charged up my Kiska, and I got going with adding all these wonderful turquoise to my painting. Just a quick note, I'm wearing a glove because I've got an issue with one of my hands and it gets a little cold, so I put a glove on just to keep my hand warm. So just in case you thought that was a bit odd, because it does look a little odd. So at this stage I want to start joining up some of my wax dots, and so the turquoise is a great filler between those dots, and at the moment I'm going in and filling in those gaps, but I'm also obviously adding extra bits where I can see it in my image. I want to try and find as much of the turquoise in my image as I can and replicate that in my painting, because it's the turquoise that's really going to bring this thing to life, especially with its contrast to that orange. But when I'm waxing this time, I'm also bearing in mind that I need to start pulling some of these wax dots together to form structures that will give the whole image some sort of form, and it'll start to make sense. It took some time to finish off the waxing, and I made sure that I checked my work and hadn't missed anything, but when I was ready it was time to pick up my paints and mix myself some darker colours. So I'm now mixing up quite a strong Prussian blue, just the one colour, because there's quite a lot of colours down on our piece of paper already, and with the nature of watercolour they will still affect the final results and obviously show through. So I'm putting this quite strong paint down in the curve on dry paper because I want it to be as intense as possible, and then as we come forward to the foreground in the image I'll water that down and make the contrasts less intense. I've taken a look at my work and I think I'm going to leave out that wave at the back. It's quite distracting, and at the level it's at, it distracts from the beautiful curve of the wave. So that I'm not putting in, but now it's time to put in the sky. The sky in the image is quite flat and grey, and I don't want that, so I'm going to create a sky with a very diluted turquoise, and here's how I do it. First off, I wet the area that I want to work with, but in some areas I'll put a lot of water and in others I'll put very little. Then I'm going to pick up a tiny bit of the turquoise onto my brush and dab it onto the area that I want my sky. I've made the paper quite damp, and actually that's caused it to wrinkle slightly because this isn't a really good high quality watercolour paper, and I'm going to use that to my advantage. So I'm just dabbing on a little bit of that turquoise onto the wet paper and I'm going to let it do the work. And all I need to do now is just leave it to dry. So that's now dry and I'm very happy with that. It's simple, but it just adds a little bit of extra interest to the background. But now it's time to pick up my Kiska and get on with some more waxing, because there's lots now for me to wax in. I want to finish off the top of the wave and give that a really good definition, and then I'll go round and put in some more wax where I like the colours. But now my focus is on bringing the batik together, and so I'm going to be joining up an awful lot of the wax marks that I've already put down. Some of the wax dots that are there I can now join up and make lines, and they're part of the image in the curve of the wave. And as the curve is the focal point of my picture, I want to spend a little bit of time there making those lines really beautiful. Then it's time to start putting the foreground in, and again I'm just looking at my picture and just seeing where the colours are that I want to capture and trying to unify some of the shapes a little better. I've noticed that at the beginning of a project I spend more time putting the paint down than I do the wax, and by the end of the project it's the other way round. So I spent quite a lot of time waxing in at this stage, but it's important that I make sure that I don't miss any areas, because with batik there's no way of going back once you've gone to the next stage. Then when I was finished waxing in, it was finally time to put that last paint on my picture. So I've mixed myself up a very, very strong Prussian blue. I'm going to check it on my paper to make sure that it's intense enough, and now I'm going to start to put it down. To start with, I'm putting it down in the curve of my wave, and I'm putting it down neat onto dry paper because that's the focal point of my picture, and so there is where I want the most intense contrast, tonally and in terms of colour. This is the stage of the batik process that I get the most anxious about, because now that I'm putting down this dark colour, the image is beginning to appear, and that's when I can see whether I think this batik is going to be successful or not. Having said that though, this is also the most exciting stage for me too, because it's kind of the big reveal, and I can start to see my wave taking shape. Now I'm just removing some of the paint that's sitting on the top of the wax. If the paint dries there and then I iron it off, it will stay on my painting, which I don't want. So I'll take it off now, and I'll probably do another clean right at the end. Now the next thing I want to do is I really want to start to add even more definition to this. And this is the stage, but I start to use some black. Black needs to be used very sparingly in watercolour batik, although traditionally in fabric batik it's used as a dominant colour. But within watercolour, it tends to flatten and dull the images slightly because it is such a dense colour. So I'm using it very sparingly. But right at the end is when I introduce black to my picture. But as I said, there's very little black in this painting, and so therefore I want to make sure I use it wisely, make sure that I don't overuse it, and it's just there to add an extra definition right at the end of this final painting stage. But obviously when using a black, I want to blend it in very well because I don't want big black marks on my painting. And so by blending it with the Prussian blue, I can achieve that, but I also can dab some off using a cloth, and that will add some texture. So now it's time to deal with the foreground, which is an area that I have to say I've left to last because it is probably going to be the most challenging, simply because I need to make it soft and I don't want to make it the focal point. But I will be using a tiny bit of black in the front and a slightly diluted Prussian blue because I want the contrast, tonally and colour-wise, in the wave, not in the foreground. So I've diluted the colours down and I'll dilute them more as I come forward in my painting. But really at this stage, it's just putting the paint down and making sure that you're happy with the results before you walk away. Now this is probably the longest I'll be spending doing the actual painting part because obviously this being the end of my painting, I want to make sure I'm totally happy with it. And I know that as I go through this last painting process, I get braver and braver with my colour and my tones. Once I put down all the colour that I wanted and I was happy with it, I've just picked up a little bit of tissue paper and I'm taking the excess paint off of the wax on the surface. Because if that's left to dry, when I go to iron off, it will be there on my painting, and I want to keep this very crisp and fresh, and it'll make sure that my whites stay white. So I think now it's time to let the whole thing dry, and then I need to apply my final layer of wax. I do still have some final tweaks that I want to do to my painting, but I want to protect my sky, put that in and get the paper nice and flat, because putting lots of hot wax onto a flat surface on this paper flattens it out again. Looking at my painting, I think there is a little bit of balancing that needs to go on. The definition that the dark colours were meant to provide has been lost once the paint has dried. Now, these are paints that will change colour when they dry. You can buy expensive watercolours that won't do that, but I'm used to this with the dyes I use on my cloth, so I'm quite comfortable working with colours that will change, and I can adapt to that. But these are new paints for me, and the darker colours have actually dried substantially lighter, so I'm going to go back in and put a little bit more definition into it, especially in the top side of the wave, which does need to go dramatically darker. And here I'm just adding some more to the foreground. I just wasn't happy with the foreground, and I have put some more definition on it. I'm aware that that is making it stand out quite a lot, but there's really nothing I can do about it at this stage. I made a decision to redefine it with a slightly darker colour. I committed to it, and I don't think it's too bad. Right, so I'm going to leave that to dry and then have another look at it. And when I did look at it, I was quite happy with what the results were. So now there's just one final stage to do. And that is simply to put a layer of wax now over my entire painting. And that is because when I iron it off, what will happen is there will be a slight tide mark where the wax stops and the raw paper begins. And if you have that on your painting, it's a nice effect that I have used in the past, but it's not something that I want here. So by putting a layer of wax over the entire picture, I'm ensuring that all of it will be covered with wax and it'll all have a uniform colour and feel to it. And then when that was done, it was time to iron off my wax, and here's the final result. This is being shown under quite a warm light because it's late at night here, just as a minor caveat. But I don't know about you, but I'm quite pleased with the end result. It was fun to do, it didn't take long, and because I kept my palette simple, I didn't come across too many problems when it came to mixing my colours. If I just zoom in for a moment and look at where the spray and the sky meet, I think that has worked very well. If it had been any more complex than that, it would have deterred away from the detail and the focal point of my painting, which was the curve of the wave. So that's the end of my video with a quick run through of how to do batik on paper. In my next video, I'll be showing you a project that you can try at home. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. Please hit the like button so I know that you're enjoying my videos. And remember, whatever you do today, just make it creative.